Hello, fellow beekeepers. Today is the day that we get to celebrate the sweetest part of being a beekeeper. Yeah, I know, it's an old joke, but hey, we are going to be harvesting our honey today. I shouldn't say harvesting, we're going to be extracting our honey today. So depending on how you keep bees, there are different ways to harvest your honey, but the way that I do it in standard Langstroth frames, what you do is once you've pulled those frames out of the hive and gotten all the bees off of it, obviously, then what you'll do is you uncap the capped cells because that's where the ripe honey is. Then you will put it in an extractor, which is basically a centrifuge. Mine happens to be a hand crank, and I'll show you all this in a second. And then you just turn the crank and the honey comes out of the cells, goes against the walls of the extractor, and then flows down, comes out the bottom. We filter it to get any miscellaneous, bee parts or whatever, filter all those out of the honey so that nothing but the pure honey ends up going into the bucket that we are going to collect it all in. Now the bucket that I use, I'll show you shortly, but it has what's called a honey gate at the bottom. The honey gate is essentially a valve, and that's what you open when you're ready to bottle the honey, and I'll show that process eventually too. So with no further ado, let me introduce you to each of the parts of the operation, explain how it all works. And oh, by the way, if it looks like I'm hot, it's because I am. It's the end of July in northern Wisconsin when we get our warmest weather. It's been in the 80s and 90s a lot lately and humid. And while it would be nice to be in an air-conditioned room doing this, extracting honey actually works better at a higher temperature because, of course, the honey becomes more viscous when it's warmer. So as tempting as it might be to chill your work area so that you're comfortable, it's going to make the job way harder, so don't do it. Now, as far as where you do it, I'm doing it in my garage. If you watched my video about processing beeswax, you'll remember I said I do it out in the garage because wax gets everywhere. Well, guess what? Honey gets everywhere too. And if you try doing it in your kitchen or something, well, first of all, you probably have the air conditioning on then, so remember point A. But point B, you're gonna end up getting honey everywhere and it's gonna make a mess. You're gonna probably piss off your spouse, so don't do that either. So we're out in the garage. It's about 78 degrees out here, so it's warm, but not, blisteringly hot. The fact that my extractor is a hand crank extractor means I'll be a lot warmer before I get done here. So let's take a look at our equipment. So the central piece of equipment in the extraction process is the extractor itself. This is an extractor that I bought from Kelly Beekeeping, and if you've been doing this long enough, you'll know that they used to be an independent company. They're now, they've been acquired by Man Lake, and I don't know if you can get this exact same model of extractor anymore, but even if they don't have this exact one, you certainly can get a very similar model from Man Lake because they certainly had similar things. I actually got this on clearance, which is what motivated me to buy it from Kelly. I buy most of my supplies from Man Lake, but then I saw this one. It was on clearance, and I saved like 40%. It was crazy, so I could not pass that up. So anyhow, this particular extractor, this is actually the second extractor that I've owned. The first extractor, I could only do 2 frames at a time, and it was what's called a tangential extractor. And this particular unit is a radial extractor. The difference between the two, a tangential extractor, you can only extract the honey from one side of the frame at a time. And so what you do is you spin it for a while, and then you have to flip each frame and then spin it again to get the honey out of the other side. So it takes a lot longer, and that one, like I said, I could only do 2 frames at a time, and it didn't matter whether they were 2 medium frames or 2 deep frames or 2 shallow frames. I could only do 2 at a time. With this particular radial unit, you can put up to 9 medium frames in at the same time. And because it's a radial extractor, it extracts honey out of both sides of the frame at the same time. And so each frame only has to be situated once in the extractor, and then you just crank it until you've extracted all of the honey out of it. So it ends up being much faster. Now this particular unit, as I mentioned, is a crank unit, and you'll see that when I put it into service. You have to turn the crank, and that's fine And in fact, I've actually found that I have friends who've never seen the process of honey extraction. They always want to come over and watch, and they usually bring their kids with them. And the kids fight over who gets to turn the crank. So don't underestimate the utility of inviting your friends to come and watch how honey is made, because it can save you a lot of work. If you happen to have a few extra bucks, you can also buy a motorized unit. In fact, this unit, I believe it did have a kit available for motorizing it. I did not buy the kit. I ended up buying this right before Man Lake bought Kelly. I don't even know if I'll be able to buy a kit for it now, but I've had it for 3 years, and I've been using it with the hand crank, and with I only keep 4 hives, so with 4 hives, the amount of honey that I end up extracting, the crank unit, yeah, sure, it's a workout, but it's not that bad. All right, also in front of the extractor, you'll see the bucket that I talked about. So there's the bucket. It's just a regular 3.5 gallon bucket, but notice that it is rated for food grade. It's food grade plastic. So you can't like go to your local home improvement store and pick up the buckets that they sell there because they're not designed to have food in them, and they may leach chemicals into your honey. So don't try to cheap out on this. If you really want to save money, the best way to get buckets like this is to go down to your local grocery store that has a deli, and they oftentimes buy a lot of the things that they buy, you know, the salad dressings, potato salads, macaroni salads, things like that. They buy in these buckets, and so they have tons of these buckets. In some cases, they pay a deposit on those buckets, and so they return them to the vendor when they are done with them. But in many cases, they're disposable, and they literally just throw them away or recycle them. I've found that if you go to the local grocery store and you go and talk to somebody at the deli and ask them, do you have any buckets that you don't need anymore, you can get a lot of different buckets, and you can get them for generally free. They'll give them to you so that they don't have to deal with it. So anyhow, with this particular bucket, as I mentioned, it has a honey gate on the bottom. The honey gate is what you open when you're dispensing the honey in and putting it in the bottles that you're going to sell your honey in, or store your honey in, or give your honey away as gifts in. The honey gate is essential, and you can either buy a bucket like this one that comes with the honey gate pre-installed, or you can actually buy the honey gate separately. In fact, I think I have one. So you can buy the honey gate separately and then install it yourself in a bucket that you get from wherever, including the local grocery store. One thing I will tell you is, if you're lucky, the grocery store might get some of their supplies in buckets that are square rather than round, and those are a lot easier to install the honey gate in. It's a lot easier to get a good seal if you're putting it against a flat surface than if you're putting it against the rounded surface, but it'll work in either one. Before you can even put the frames into the extractor, you have to, as I mentioned earlier, uncap those frames. So the bees, when the honey reaches the right moisture content, which is basically anything below 17.5% or so, that's when they consider the honey ripe. And once it's ripe, they will cap off those cells. They will not cap it off until it gets to that low level of moisture. And so many times you'll end up going in finding that you have frames that are 90 or 95% capped, but there will be a few around the edges that haven't been capped yet. That's because that honey on the outside edges hasn't gotten down to the level of moisture that the bees want it for them to consider it ripe, so they won't have capped it. If you go into your hive and you're pulling out frames thinking you're going to process them, and you find that they've got, that they're only 90 or 95% capped, the easiest thing to do is just leave them in there and go back and check in another week, and in most cases you'll find that they've finished off those frames. If on the other hand, if you're getting near the end of the season and the nectar flow is tailing off and you don't think they're going to keep bringing in honey, then they may not cap those cells off at all. So at that point, you can still pull the frame out, but the thing is you don't want to have too many frames with too many open cells, or when you extract it, the moisture content will be too high and the honey will spoil. Basically, anything over 20%, almost certainly the honey will spoil. So you want to make sure it's below that. And the way that you can tell that is you use a tool called a refractometer, and I have one of those as well. So this little device is a refractometer, and it's used to measure the moisture content in your honey. It's very easy to use. It has this little flap that you flip up. There's this lens, I guess you call it a lens down here. You literally put one drop of honey in the center of it, you flip the cap down and it spreads it out. And then once you've done that, then you just take it, put it up to your eye, point it up at a light, and you'll be able to see inside there will be moisture content percentages listed on the scale in there. I don't think there's any way I'm going to be able to get a picture of what that looks like. So you just have to trust me that it's in there, and you can adjust the focus and whatnot until you can see it. My eyes aren't what they used to be, so I end up having to focus it. You can also do it with your glasses on too. But anyhow, once you get it to once you get the drop of honey in there and you read off the moisture percentage, you'll know that you've got your honey's dry enough. If your honey is above 20%, and you process it and you put it in jars, you can it, over time it's going to ferment, and then the honey will go bad, and you don't want to sell somebody fermented honey. So the best thing to do if you end up with a bunch of honey that the moisture content is too high is you actually can use a standard household dehumidifier unit. I've done this before. If you've got like a large box or something, like a refrigerator box, but it wouldn't even have to be that large. Something that's big enough that you could fit your dehumidifier inside the box, as well as a pail like this pail that I showed you that has the honey gate on it. That pail with the top off, you put that in, turn on the dehumidifier, let it go for a few days, and then measure your moisture content again. I actually let it go for too long. The first time I did it, I took it all the way down to 15%. It didn't need to be that dry. When it gets that dry, it ends up not flowing as well either. So you don't want to get it any lower than you need to. So, I mean, really, if you get it down to 18.5% or 18%, you don't have to get it down to the 17.5 that the bees do. It's going to be fine if you get it to 18 or 18.5. So anyhow, that's what the refractometer is for. You can find these lots of places. I believe I bought this one from Man Lake. They're not inexpensive, but to not have your season's honey harvest go bad, it's well worth the investment. So I talked about the uncapping tank and then went off on that little tangent about honey moisture content. The uncapping tank is where you take the caps off of the frames of honey. And you generally do that. There's a couple of different ways you can do it. In fact, if you get a beekeeping magazine, you'll find that there are lots of different devices out there for sale for uncapping your frames. Large industrial scale apiaries that have hundreds or thousands of hives, they actually can buy motorized uncapping units that will, you basically feed the frame through and it'll uncap it. For 4 hives, like a hobbyist like I have, that would be way more money than it would make sense to spend. Those are like $1,500 entry level. So anyhow, what I do is something way much lower tech. You can see if you watched my beeswax processing video, you'll recognize my setup over here with the pot in it. The pot it basically just has boiling water, and I keep it, well actually now that it's this hot I can turn it down a little bit, it doesn't have to be boiling. But notice that I've just got a couple of knives in here, and the knives, this heats up the blade, and once the blade is hot, then we can use it to cut the caps. You basically are trying to peel as thin a layer of the wax off the top of the frames as you can to get at the honey. The more, if you cut off too much, it's not the end of the world, but it's going to fall. What's going to end up happening is it's going to fall into the bottom of your uncapping tank, and that's why there's a honey gate at the bottom of the uncapping tank too, is because you'll end up with honey in the bottom as well. It's much more efficient to get it out of the extractor. You'll need to let the uncappings, the cappings that you've cut off, you'll have to leave in here for a day or two to get as much of the honey as possible to drip down through. So it's better to not cut off any more of the capping that you can. And I'll show you how that works. There's also another tool that I use in addition to the hot knife. This is called a capping scratcher. And the capping scratcher, with these sharp little ends here, you can actually use it to scrape the tops of the cells and get them to open up that way. And typically what I'll do is I'll go down with the knife first, and in some cases the bees might have the honeycomb recessed a little bit into the frame so that the knife can't get at it. And then you take the capping scratcher and you don't have to take the entire cover off. You're just trying to perforate the cover so that the honey can come out when the extractor is being spun. As I mentioned earlier, it's going to get messy. You're going to get honey on the floor. You're going to get honey all over the table. You're going to get honey on the, if you're up near a wall, you're going to end up with honey on your wall. Make sure that all the surfaces where you're going to be working on extracting honey can be cleaned easily. I actually hose down the floor and clean it off before I start, and I'll do the same thing when I'm done to clean up any honey that ends up on the floor. It is a garage floor. If I drop honey on the floor, I'm not picking it up, obviously. But it is something that you want to be able to be in a place where you can clean. And then having a bucket of water and a washcloth handy is also a good idea, because sooner or later you're going to drip some honey somewhere, and you're not going to want to let it sit. So I keep just an old ice cream bucket with some water in it and a washcloth, and then I can use that. And from time to time I'll wipe off the handles of the knives, because they can get pretty sticky as well. All right, so that's all the equipment that's involved. So with no further ado, I'm actually going to start the process and set the camera up so you can see what I'm doing. I probably won't be talking a whole lot while I'm doing this, unless there's something that I forgot to tell you before now. And considering that I've been talking for like 10 minutes, I can't imagine that I've forgotten anything, but we'll see. So we have some regular garden variety totes that we picked up at the local big box store. And we use that to store the frames that we've pulled from the hives. I take these out to the apiary with me when I'm ready to start pulling the frames out. And then I can actually put 8 full frames in this tote at a time. And this is what a cap frame looks like. So there are a couple of open cells on this, mostly because this full frame was capped, but when I started pulling it out of the hive, it got bumped against a protrusion from a neighboring frame and ripped it open. But for the most part, this entire frame is ripe. So this is all ripe honey. So we're going to start off by uncapping this. So first I'll go over to my uncapping tank, and there's a little screw on this piece of wood that goes across, and that's just to give you somewhere to hold the frame in place, so that you can use one hand to hold the frame and the other hand to use your knife. So the one downside of using the hot water to keep the knives warm is you have to wipe them off, because you don't, of course, the idea here is don't have too much moisture in your honey. The last thing you want to do is put water in there. So then all you do is you just take the warm knife and you just run it right along the edges of the frame. And with any luck, you're going to get it to come off like that, and you're going to expose the ripe honey. And if you start, whoops, I'm just cutting into the wood a little bit. And if you start to get to the point where the knife doesn't want to go into the wax anymore because it's starting to cool down, that's why I have 2 knives. I can switch back and forth between the 2 different knives as I'm doing this. And you just kind of saw back and forth. Even though this particular knife isn't a serrated edge knife, if you saw back and forth, it helps get it open. Okay, so these cells down here and a few of these up here are a little too far inset, and I can't get at them, so that's when the capping scratcher comes into play. And we just use that. You don't push down that hard, and you kind of do it at an angle, and you're just drawing this across because you're just trying to open them up a little bit. And you want to get every cell open. Any cell that isn't opened at all, it's not going to come out in the extractor. So you need to try to get every one of them to open up for you. And then once you get the first side done, flip it over, you go to the other side. And it really doesn't matter. Some people prefer to saw upwards, some people prefer to go downward. I just do it however I need to get at the capping that I need to get at. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning about the capping wax, this is actually the purest wax in the entire hive. As you can tell, it's very, very light. If you're new into beekeeping and you go into the brood cells, typically they have like a tan color capping, and that's just because the wax that they're using is not as pure as this. This is the cleanest wax in the hive. So if you decide you want to use the wax for making cosmetics, for example, this is actually the best wax for those kinds of uses, because it's the cleanest, and it's the nicest color when you finish processing it. So that processing that I did, most of that was actually old brood frame wax, so it was quite dark. This is much cleaner. Okay, so now that I've got it stripped off or uncapped on both sides and have scratched, there's a few I missed actually, now that I look at it closer. Let me double check the other side, because I thought I got them all, but maybe I didn't. There's a couple there. For the most part, looks pretty good. All right, if there's little pieces of wax and stuff on here, don't worry, because when we spin this around on the extractor, it's going to come out the bottom, and it's going to go through there's a filter on the bottom that will filter out all the little pieces. So now we're going to take the frame that we've uncapped, and we're going to put this in the extractor. And if you remember, if you've learned this, the way the bees make the cells in the honeycomb, they're tipped slightly towards the top of the frame. So that means you want the top of the frame out, so that when you spin the extractor, the honey will come out more completely out of the cells. And you just set the frame in here. There's notches that hold the frame. And so there's one frame, and now I need to, you could spin it with just one frame, but the problem is it's going to be very unbalanced and it's going to shake a lot. So you always want to have, notice that there's 3 segments in this circle. There's 3 in each one. If you don't have a full 9 frames to extract from, you want to have a multiple of 3 so that you can have it balanced. The more balanced, if you've ever had your washing machine become unbalanced, you know what it's like when you start spinning it and it's not balanced. It'll go all over the place. The same is true for the extractor. So you want to even this out so that it's all balanced. So I'm going to uncap some more frames, and then we'll get pictures of once I've got all 9 frames in here. Okay, so now that we have 9 frames uncapped and put into the extractor, we'll start to turn the crank. Now this crank it's spring loaded, so that it'll actually pop out, and it's loose at that point. Can you see that? And so you have to push it in when you start to turn it, but then friction will hold it into place. Now the key is when you start, you want to go slowly. Especially I use all foundationless, and so I don't have wires or anything holding the comb in. So I don't want to go too fast, because if I went too fast right away with all the weight from all the honey, it would actually rip the honeycomb right out. And I don't know if you can see it very well, but there's already honey coming out and hitting the inside of the extractor. Zoom in. And so as the honey starts to come out, I'll start cranking it a little faster. And so, you know, it all goes out to the outside, and when it starts to build up, it starts to run down the inside of the walls of the extractor. And then as it does that, eventually it'll get down to the bottom. There's nothing coming out yet, because it'll take a while. And you also have to make sure that you leave the honey gate open when you're doing this. If you have it closed, it'll start to pool at the bottom. Eventually it'll hit the bottom of the frames, and then that would actually, that could very well damage your frames as well as the extractor itself. So, but as they get lighter, I can actually crank faster and faster. Oh, and now we've got honey coming out at the bottom. So it's going through the strainer that I have. So if there's any little pieces of wax, occasionally you'll have a dead bee in here. You want to catch all that, obviously, and keep that from getting into your honey that you're going to bottle. All right. What a beautiful sight. And you have to be careful. If it gets going too fast, it can actually go faster than this filter can handle. And if that happens, then you got to close the honey gate. And also, little pieces of wax will eventually plug up the screen. This is actually a 2-piece. It's a fairly coarse mesh above, and then underneath it, there's a finer mesh. And so occasionally you have to close the honey gate and then get in there with like a spatula and scrape out the wax that's building up in there. Then you can just throw that in the uncapping tank with the other wax cappings that you've already cut off. I don't know if you can hear that, but you can hear it dripping to the bottom of the bucket now. So it's going through both meshes in the filter and dripping to the bottom. Each one of these frames, so these are medium frames, each one of these frames will have between 5 and 8 pounds of honey in it, depending on how far out the bees drew the honeycomb. So there's really no scientific way to say when you've spun these enough. You basically go by how much resistance you feel. You can kind of feel how heavy the frames are. And then when you think you've got it all out, then you can open the lid up and try lifting out a frame and see if it feels empty. You'll be able to tell because obviously when you put it in, it weighed somewhere between 5 and 8 pounds, and it's just going to weigh a few ounces once all the honey's out of it. Once most of the honey's out, you can really get it going fast. And the faster it goes, the more of the honey that it'll get out of the cells. So it's getting really easy to crank now because there's not much weight left in here. So now you can basically go as fast as you can crank, and you don't have to worry about damaging the honeycomb at this point. If you're using foundation, you can be a little bit more aggressive than I am because I'm foundationless. But you know, as long as your comb is connected on at least 3 sides of your frames, you usually don't have too much to worry about, even if you're foundationless. So now our first 9 frames are good and empty. I don't know how well you can see that, but there's a little honey in there, but not very much. There's actually more on the wood than there is in the cells. Now there are 2 schools of thought here. You can either put them away wet, with the advantage that next year when you put your honey supers on, since they smell like honey, the bees will go immediately right in there. The downside of that is honey is hygroscopic, which means that it will absorb moisture out of the air. So if it's humid weather like it is here now, and I put these away, the humidity inside the totes that I put them in, it'll actually be able to absorb that into the honey that's on these frames. That in itself is probably not enough to make the honey spoil, but if the tote that you put it in doesn't seal tightly and outside air can infiltrate, then there's a possibility that enough moisture would get in there that the honey would go bad. And if the honey goes bad, it's not going to smell good to the bees. They're not going to want to go on it. So what I generally do is I take these frames and I'll put several of them into a honey super, and I'll set it out 50 or 75 feet away from my hives, far enough away. You don't want to put it right next to the hives because that actually promotes robbing. So then your stronger hives will go and steal honey from your weaker hives. So it's better to put it out a ways so the bees have to go to it. And that way you're not attracting bees from one hive to another hive by having it next to another hive. So anyhow, I'll set it up out there. I'll leave it for, honestly, an afternoon. Once the bees figure out that it's there, it won't take them any time at all to clean all of the honey that's left on here, to the point that you'll be able to touch it and it won't be sticky or anything. It's amazing how clean they can get this. So now that most of the honey is run down and dripped out of the extractor, you'll see, like I mentioned, that a fair amount of wax cappings, little pieces of it build up here. And so if I tried to run another 9 frames through, almost certainly it would get to the point that would want to overflow, because so much of the capping is in here that it's going to block the screen and it's not going to be able to filter it. So you can just use a spatula and take out what's in here, and then I'll just take this and I'll put it in with my uncapping tank and let the honey that's in these cappings leak out and to the bottom of my uncapping tank, and then I can get the honey out of there tomorrow or the next day. So there you go. Now it's a lot cleaner and it's going to be able to run through. And like I mentioned, this particular filter has 2 different meshes. So that's the coarser mesh on top, and then that actually inserts. So you pull that out, now you can see the finer mesh underneath it. Now notice that some of really small pieces of wax got through, and those have been caught by the finer mesh that's down on the bottom. So you'll have to clean this out occasionally as well, not as often as this one, but you will have to do it from time to time. So after letting it sit for a while, all of the honey that was in the extractor has now gone through the filter, and you'll notice it's a little foamy on top. That's normal. The bubbles, there's actually bubbles throughout the honey, and I'm going to bottle some now so you can see what it looks like, but it will be a little cloudy today because it has the bubbles in it, but as the bubbles work their way to the top of the jar, it'll get clearer and clearer. After a couple of days, it'll be very clear. So before I bottle any, however, I'm curious to see how much I ended up getting. So I will take this up to my bathroom scale and I will weigh it. I first will weigh, I have a second bucket exactly like this one. I will weigh that so I know how much it weighs empty. Then I'll weigh this one with honey in it, and then we'll subtract, and the difference will be how much honey we processed today. Okay, so it turns out we extracted 38.5 pounds. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, I thought you said there was going to be between 5 and 8 pounds per frame. And don't forget that we had a whole bunch that came out in the uncapping tank. I just kind of hefted that, and I'm going to estimate that weighed about 10 pounds. There was about 10 pounds of honey in that. So when all is said and done, we're going to end up with close to 50 pounds out of those 9 frames. So, you know, a little bit over 5 pounds. So about what I expected. So now we just need to put this in a jar. So this is where the honey gate comes in. All we have to do, loosen the wing nut, and here comes our honey. And you run it down the side of the jar to kind of keep the amount of bubbles to a minimum. But like I mentioned, there are going to be bubbles in it. Since I just extracted this today, it's going to have bubbles in it anyway. So we'll fill up our jar, close up the honey gate, and there we go. Okay, I left one jar with no labels on it so that we could look at it tomorrow morning after the air bubbles had had a chance to work their way to the top of the jar, and you can see how much clearer it will be. But here is our finished product. So this is a 2-pound jar, or a little bit less than a kilogram for our non-American viewers. And there you go. That's what comes from the beehives at the Rockin' KB Ranch. Okay, this has been sitting for about 18 hours. Now, I don't know how well you can see this, but it's a lot less cloudy than it was last night. A lot of the bubbles have worked their way to the top. In fact, if you can tell anything, you can probably tell it's clearer. It's more translucent at the bottom than it is farther up, because the bubbles are still migrating to the top of the jar. But there you go. That's what it looks like after it's sat. And within the next day or two, it will get as clear as it's going to get. So there you have it. Thanks for watching this video and learning how to extract honey from your hives. I hope that there was something I could help you with. If there are any other things that you'd like to see me talk about, by all means, comment down below and I will get back to you. Thank you.